Religion taught me how to lie before I knew what honesty is. I still remember sitting in my Sunday school class when I was about 10 years old, and the teacher asked the entire class, "How has God been working in your life?" I heard a variety of responses. One girl, for instance, she said that she ran into an old friend at the grocery store. This friend hadn't been going to church for a long time, and she said that God had placed this friend of hers there so that she could evangelize to her and bring her back to church. And that's what she did. There was a boy in the class who also gave a story. He said that his mother came across a Bible verse that really helped him and her out through a difficult time. His grandmother and her mother had recently passed away. And as a result of finding this Bible verse, they, were able to help with their grief. And he claimed that God placed that Bible verse before them. As I sat there and listened to these stories, I couldn't help but wonder, weren't these just coincidences or happy accidents? I didn't see how God was working in their lives. I just saw people acting. And additionally, what would it make of their choices if God was determining their actions? What would it mean if the mother was pushed to read the Bible that day? Would it really matter if she had found the Bible verse? That would mean her grief on some level too was ordained by God. And on the other hand, with the girl's friend that she ran into at the grocery store, if her friend was placed there by God, what does that make of that girl's friend's choices? My pattern of thought was interrupted when the teacher turned to me and said, "Maddox, how has God been working in your life?" I stood frozen for a bit because I wasn't sure how to answer, but I felt compelled to give an answer because growing up in the church, it was looked down upon to openly doubt or to say, "Well, I don't really know. I don't really see how God is working." I felt as if I had to give a story because I wanted desperately to fit in as well. I wanted to conform out of comfort. And this is exactly what I did. I lied that day. I decided to tell a story to the entire class that they would buy to show them that I too saw God working in my life. I told them that I dropped my Bible on the ground and it opened on the perfect Bible verse and story that helped me through a difficult time too. I wasn't a very original thinker then. I was just piggybacking off the boy. When I gave this story, I was rewarded. My teacher gave me a thumbs up or a sign of affirmation saying, "Good job, Max. Like, thanks for sharing that. That was, a great story. I'm glad to see that God's working in your life." And I had so many experiences like this that I was thinking something different to what everyone else was thinking, but I really didn't trust what I was seeing in my own mind. I didn't trust my own introspective capabilities. All I did was conform because it was nice to be liked, and I disliked being disliked. I grew up in the church from, since as long as I can remember, really. And I went to Christian private school between 4 and 14 years old. During that time, I was completely immersed in Christianity. I went to science class and I was taught creationism. I went to a weekly Sunday service that was in the middle of the week. So I had two Sunday services a week, one on Wednesday, one on Sunday. And I also had sports teams and all sorts of other classes that made me, think about Christianity and embedded Christian tenets within otherwise normal subjects. And so Christianity really was in every area of my life. I remember one time when I was on the soccer team at my middle school, and the teacher was telling us that any goal I made or anything I did in the soccer field was ultimately God's doing because He's the one who created me, He gave me my body, and when I made a goal, ultimately that was for the Lord. And so when I did make a goal or I did do something that I was actually proud of, I convinced myself that I couldn't be proud of it. I discredited my own achievements. I belittled myself so that I could serve God. And this was a pattern that was common in everything I did. All of my achievements, ultimately had to be justified if they served somebody else and not myself. I remember one time I went on a missions trip when I was around the middle of high school, so about 15 or 16 years old. And we were going to Houston, Texas. And this is a picture of the group I went with. And we had, these t-shirts. And the goal was to go down to Houston, Texas into poor neighborhoods and basically give away free food as well as free Bibles and our own testimonies, our stories of how we converted to Christianity, and basically with the goal of trying to convince other people to convert as well. And so we went down there, we flew down, and I still remember how hot it was. We were a bunch of kids basically being put into child labor through the church. And I went down there we painted something, and we also gave away free food. But I remember this one moment pretty vividly. My pastors asked me to go up to the front doors of people and knock on those doors and give away the free food, of course, but also to tell my story of how I was convinced by Christianity, what made me become a Christian in the first place. And I knew on some level what my story was. I knew that I was converted in first grade under the guidance of my first grade teacher. I still remember that day quite vividly. I broke down into tears as well as all the other first graders did. My teacher had this great power to emotionally prime us into believing. But when I went to the door, I wasn't sure how to persuade somebody to believe in Christianity. It was always an emotional thing for me. And I never really questioned this. I never really questioned that. I never really embraced Christianity on a reasonable basis. I had just adopted it because I was mimicking others. And I had, in one critical moment in first grade, I had this religious experience of sorts. Now, at first, I was really scared to go up to the door because I didn't want to do it, basically. It was just scary. And I really felt guilty not doing it because I saw everyone else around me was going up to doors and knocking, and I wasn't. And I felt that I was supposed to, because if I didn't, what kind of Christian am I? Eventually, the guilt made me want to finally knock on this door. And when I did, a Muslim lady opened the door. I could tell because she had a hijab on, and she also, after a few minutes of conversation, explained to me that, she believed in Allah. Now, this was a curveball that I didn't expect. I didn't know how to respond to this because how was I supposed to explain that her faith in God was somehow different from my faith in God? As a kid, at this age, 16 years old, basically, I really wasn't sure what to do, so I said, "Okay, have a nice day," and then I walked off. Basically, I have many more experiences and many stories like this, but basically, in essence, what I was taught within Christianity is that I was supposed to serve God and not myself. If I didn't, then I was basically guilty and would be sent to hell. And I was supposed to serve God and obey them. So I also had this damned if you do, damned if you don't situation that recurred throughout my childhood. Like, if you reflect back on the story I just told of knocking on the Muslim lady's door and hesitating before going up to the door, I felt immense guilt before I even did it. But then when I finally knocked on the door, there was all sorts of troubles I had there as well. So whichever way I turned, I ended up suffering. And this is really how I thought life was supposed to be. I thought that this is what it's like to be human. And this is what I was taught within Christianity. We are fallen creatures and we can't really be happy. We just have to obey God blindly because we're just puny humans who can't understand anything. Fast forward to 2020, and COVID completely hits the world. Governments force everyone to lock themselves indoors. And around this time, I was around 17 years old, and I had just graduated high school. And our high school actually let out 2 months earlier than expected. So I had a 5-month summer instead of a 3-month summer at this time. So I remember around this time thinking, oh, this is great. I can just go home and play video games, basically. A lot of my teachers didn't know what to do, and because everything went completely remote and nobody was prepared for this, a lot of my teachers weren't sure how to use the computer to run the classes. So I just went home and did as little coursework as I needed to pass my final year of school, and that's what I did for those 2 months. And then as summer entered, I fell into a deep depression because all I was doing is playing video games. And during this time, I began to realize that I really did need structure in my life. But I also realized that all the structure I was given prior to this was just structure given to me by school and church. And that if I really wanted to make my life better, I had to like make choices for myself. And this was really scary at first because I wasn't used to doing this. I was more used to just following the crowd and mimicking others around me and following the schedules others put on my plate. And so there's a few options that came up for me on where I could take my life next at this point. My family and friends and, general culture kind of gave me these two main options. One of them being going into the military. Both my parents were in the Air Force, and they kind of demonstrated to me that the military is an option. I could go in there and learn how to become a radio operator or basically get college paid for by going to the military. But the military didn't really interest me because I would have to sign away 3 years of my life. Nah, I don't want to do that. On the other hand, there was college. And with college, that was very expensive, although interesting. I could jump into engineering or computer development, and those were some of the subjects I was interested in. And I didn't want to go into severe debt with college, and I didn't want to lock in for 3 to 4 years in college or the military. So I sat on my hands for a while until my mother reminded me of this program called Praxis. Praxis is basically this online college alternative program. And basically, the goal of it is to get you from maybe like a fast food job or no job to a really good job that you have a lot of headroom to grow as a young person. And this really interested me because they basically promised a better career, a better entry-level role than just, fast food. At the time, I was working at Chick-fil-A, which is a chicken restaurant here in the United States. And when I was looking at Praxis, I thought it was a good option. I decided to leap at it. Even though it was scary, even though I wasn't sure, I said to myself, okay, these other options aren't good, but let's see what Praxis is like. So I joined. And in Praxis, I learned all sorts of skills. And one of the things that we did were these value exercises where we asked ourselves, okay, what do we want out of life? And what actions do we have to take to get there? Very, very straightforward. And some of the stuff that you've probably heard here talked about at the conference already. And by doing this exercise, I realized that most of my values weren't really things that I did because I valued them, it's because other people do. And one of the most fun exercises I did was I hate list. So listing out everything you hate just so you can avoid that because I didn't want to. And I realized I don't like bureaucracy or being tied up too much. And I do like flexibility, and I like the ability to move and travel and explore new ideas. So what this exercise helped me do is just reflect more on what I wanted. And it got me outside of this Christian bubble or the bureaucratic bubble of the Washington, D.C. area, which is where I grew up, and made me start thinking about how I could choose what I wanted out of life. I remember one time I was on an advisor call at the end of my 3-month boot camp. So in Praxis, there's a 3-month boot camp in which you learn about how businesses operate, as well as the different roles in businesses, and building some skills to try to help you get those roles as a young person. Because at this time I was just working at Chick-fil-A, I didn't have many skills to get myself a job. And so Praxis was helping me do this. But basically, I was at the end of the 3-month period, and I was about to enter the job hunt, and that's where the job hunt is within Praxis. And on this advisor call, I remember my advisor giving me this piece of advice that's really simple, but when I thought about it more, it made a lot of sense. In order to grow, you just have to work hard. You have to do difficult things. And this made sense to me. Anytime I've grown, it was always difficult. It's never been the case that I've grown when it's not difficult. And so she asked me, Maddox, what is the thing that comes immediately to mind that you see as difficult and that you think you should do? And immediately what came to mind is sales. There was a few options on my table, but sales was the type of job that I knew scared me because I was an introvert for most of my life. I considered myself an introvert, and I knew that if I wanted to be somebody that, could convince others and persuade others and to grow in life, I needed to gain communication skills. So that's what I did. I went into sales, and got into an entry-level job at a software company called PandaDoc. Now, the reason I'm telling you all this is because I think what Praxis did for me is help me develop a skill, a mindset that enabled me to start looking at other areas of my life and more independently thinking about them as well, and not simply just accepting them because somebody else told me to. And at first, this involved finance. I was thinking about, how taxes work. I used to collect coins since I was 12 years old, and I was kind of interested in that. But basically, eventually, I set my gaze on religion. I began to think, okay, how is religion serving me? And what value am I getting out of it? Around this time, I actually was trying to get more serious about Christianity, ironically enough. I had this assumption in my mind that Christianity is a good thing, but I knew, as I kind of indicated with the experience I showed earlier, when I was knocking on the door of that lady, I really wasn't sure how to persuade somebody of Christianity. And so I went to a class at my church, which was basically about how to argue logically for Christianity so that you can convince others of it too, and that they can become Christians. And the teacher in that class gave an idea to me and taught me an idea that has stuck with me ever since. And the idea was this: in order to convince somebody else, you first have to convince yourself. When I sat and reflected on this, I realized that I wasn't really convinced. On an emotional level, sure, I felt Christianity was true. That was the whole reason I was here in this class. But I had to be honest with myself. I really didn't know how to argue for it. I couldn't convince myself as if I was a non-believer, for example. And when I realized this, I began to ask a lot more questions. I began to ask myself, well, how can I know how anything is true? How can I convince myself of anything? How is knowledge even possible in the first place? What even is truth? Where does it come from? Why do other people seem so certain about other things? All these questions flooded into my mind. And so through this class, not really the teacher's intention, I began to slowly whittle away at my Christianity, in fact. At this point, I decided to suspend my cognitive belief. Although I had this emotional side that was still tied to it, I knew that if I was going to be objective or rational when it came to approaching this subject, I had to suspend my belief and act as if I was a non-believer in that respect so that I could actually figure out what facts are in support of this. So what happened through this experience is I had this reignition of truth, this desire for truth in me. From a young age, I actually desired truth, but everyone around me dissuaded me from doing so. They said that I should believe the Bible as being incontrovertibly true, as something you can't question and is just true always. But through this class, ironically enough, I began to want to know what the truth is so that I could, again, ironically, ground my Christianity and prove it to myself. Eventually, with my mind primed to look out for answers to these questions that were generated in my mind, the main question being, what is truth? I came across this conference called TOSCon in 2021, and I attended, which is now called Level Up. And here at this conference, I came across a variety of ideas, but some of the most powerful ideas I came across were, one, this idea that there's something called philosophy. And it turns out these questions I was asking about truth and how do I know what is true, how can I get knowledge, these are all philosophical questions. And so for the first time, I had this community of people who were writing about these things and talking about them in a very deep way. At first, I was horribly confused because I was 17 or 18 at the time, and the the writing was somewhat complicated, and there's terms that I wasn't familiar with, but I slowly began to understand. Now, there was one article for me that I think absolutely changed my thinking on a subject I never really had thought about explicitly before. And this was Reason versus Mysticism, Truth and Consequences by Craig Biddle. Basically, this article outlines how reason and faith are two ways of approaching knowledge that are at odds, at essential odds. by reading this article, I realized that I had been trying to go by faith when it came to Christianity, but in every other area of my life, I was going by reason. And because of that class I went to, I actually had started trying to put Christianity in the reason category. And so, on some level, I really did understand this. I thought to myself, it does make sense. Like, you should try to prove things by reason. Let me define reason for you here. This is just my own words, so if there's any errors, that's my fault. But this is what I've written. Reason is basically our capacity as human beings to take facts of reality and form knowledge and principles. So, for example, I can look at there's a chair there, there's a podium here, and there's maybe a couch, and I can form those into abstractions or concepts called furniture. And that's a way I can group these perceptual concretes, these things I can just see directly. And this is kind of the power of the human mind. We can form these abstract concepts and form higher and higher abstractions until we can like form very broad principles. And these are the principles that help us guide our life at the most fundamental level. And this is what reason is, and is something that was kind of explicitly defined for me for the first time in a very clear way through this article. On the other hand, there's faith. And faith is basically considering something to be true on just believing it to be true without any evidence, and actually and sometimes in contradiction to evidence. For example, I used to believe in creationism, that the world was created in 7 days. Technically, God rested on the final day, so technically 6 days. But I realized that, my faith in creationism was actually contradictory to the facts, this massive amount of facts of all of these fossils that demonstrated that there was a slow progression over time leading up to what we call hominids and humans, the theory of evolution. At this point, I wasn't really considering a theory of evolution. I came into thinking about Christianity or deconstructing it from a different route, but this was something that kind of came to mind, that this was actually in contradiction to that other theory that I know about. So not only did I learn about these two fundamental concepts when it comes to the field of what's called epistemology, which is basically just a big fancy word for the theory of, or the study of, like, how we know things, basically. And so this really helped me start thinking in terms of, okay, am I doing this on reason or am I doing this by faith? And I started to categorize things, and I realized that slowly and slowly, everything within religion that I believed in, I was going by faith, and that I had to put it firmly in the reason category if I wanted things to be true. And the reason why this is the case is this: with faith, anything goes. And let me unpack that. So, if you remember the Muslim lady that I ran into at the door, we both believed in different gods, and we both claimed that we were confirming the truth of that God, the existence of the God, via our faith. But if we're both going by faith, and it's obviously the case that the Christian God Yahweh and the Muslim God Allah can't simultaneously exist at the same time in the same respect, that would be violating the law of non-contradiction. And so I realized that this isn't possible, and that faith actually really doesn't work because it creates all sorts of contradictions. And that's why so many people disagree with each other, is because they're probably going by faith and not going by the facts. And so I realized that faith justifies not only just belief in different gods without any evidence. There's no way to differentiate which one is the right God because they're both going by faith. This also permits, if you accept faith as a means of knowledge, it permits all sorts of atrocities. People have committed all sorts of atrocities in the name of faith. Terrorists have, assaulted people because on the name of faith, in the name of faith, and in the name of Allah, and so on. So this is some stuff that I learned in philosophy that comes from the level of like how I know things, and these were some concepts that really helped clarify in my mind where I might be going wrong. So this is Ayn Rand, and so basically, I think something that I learned from her that was key to me beginning to deconstruct my Christianity and look at it more thoroughly is her conception of morality. So morality, according to her, and I think this makes sense if you look at the facts too, is that it's this code of values that we can use to guide our actions. Basically, morality is you can think of it as the operating system of our minds that tells us how to act. And the thing about it is that morality can either be rational or irrational and a spectrum in between. There can be aspects of morality that are life-serving. There can be aspects of it that are anti your life. And something that I learned is that there's these different kinds of moralities, and that I, for the longest time, had been accepting a kind of morality that I didn't even know I was accepting. And this was the morality of altruism, specifically religious altruism. Altruism is, in other words, is otherism, meaning that being moral, according to altruism, means giving yourself up for others and sacrificing yourself to them. And and in my case, it meant obeying God. But I realized that Rand was criticizing altruism, and she basically pointed out, well, there's no reasons for altruism. If you can find them, like, try to find them. And I tried finding them, and I couldn't. I kept coming to this problem of there's really nothing I can observe that tells me that I should sacrifice myself to others. I didn't really see how, for example, why I should, be forced to become a missionary, like just because God said so. And then I began to want reasons for why God was telling me these things. But I'll get into that a bit later. Rand also clarified the concept of selfishness for me. And this is a big part of her morality, her specific morality that she developed called rational egoism. Egoism gets a bad rap in philosophy. A lot of people think, oh, when you're an egoist, you just want to prey on others and sacrifice them to yourself so that you can just benefit in the immediate moment. And although people can do this, this isn't what happened to me when I was reading Rand is that I started to ask, well, is that actually selfish? Is it actually selfish or self-serving? Is it actually good for you to give up others to yourself and like hurt them and steal from them, etc.? And it turns out it really isn't. If I hurt somebody or steal from them or prey on them, there's all sorts of consequences. There's existential and psychological consequences. Under the existential category, there's the consequence that they might just put you in prison. They might like chase after you. And so you have to face the psychological consequences of always looking over your shoulder to see, you're paranoid basically because you're hurting others. Additionally, there's a big hit to your self-esteem too. And you create this version of a world in which everyone is like out to get you. Because if you steal from others, why should somebody else not steal from you? If you don't operate on the same principle, then somebody else can operate on your same principle. And this is a big issue. And so what Rand advocates for is rational self-interest, looking at the facts of reality and seeing that we actually need to act in our own self-interest in order to live. And this is the whole purpose of acting toward our values and being interested. Because if we aren't, we die. Like if I don't have this water here or food, air, etc., then I wither away. And I also wither away psychologically if I don't have good friendships. If I have an abusive friendship, then that's detrimental to my psychology. It can actually lead to biological decay as well. I can leave the scientists figuring out how exactly all that works, but that's kind of what happens here. And so you need to act towards the things that enable you to live. And Rand kind of clarified this for me. There's a lot more there that I could unpack, but there's too much to go over in this talk. After reading about all these ideas over about 2 to 3 years by attending Level Up and reading books and listening to speakers that attended Level Up and the books that were written by them, I began to ask a ton of questions because a lot of what was said at the conference completely contradicted everything I believed to be true. And so, as a result, I went to my pastors, actually, because I trusted their authority, but I wanted to understand why they were saying that, we should obey God, why the Bible is true. And so I just started acting like a 3-year-old and asking why repetitively, essentially. I remember one conversation I had with my pastors after a Sunday school class, and we had gone over a lesson about the virtue of unconditional love, and I was asking questions about that. I wasn't understanding how loving somebody who isn't deserving of it is just. That's not really justice. You should reward the good for being good, and you should also punish the wicked. I so thought. But it turns out that Christianity allows for injustice in the name of love. And I was confused by this, and I was trying to understand why my pastors were advocating for such a concept of love. I said, well, I haven't ever seen an example of how unconditional love ever works out. And after long conversations like this, I've had a variety of conversations like this with them. And the conversations always boil down to something along these lines. Sorry, Maddox, but God's ways are higher than our ways. He's mysterious, and he has this grander plan we can't possibly conceive. So him saying that you should, hurt somebody or give yourself up to him and just obey him without thinking about why you should obey him, we should just obey him because, he's all powerful. And in the end, everything works out for his good. And that you just need to have faith, Maddox. You just need to have faith. With these new ideas in my head, and when I heard them say, you just need to have faith, what that translated into for me is you need to give up your mind. You need to stop looking at reality and just bend over and, put the yoke on and obey God without questioning, without understanding it, and just blindly accepting authority. But this no longer made any sense to me. At one point, it seemed to, but then I was just lying to myself. But now, since I was looking at things a bit more clear, I realized that my pastors weren't the authority I thought they were. God wasn't the authority I thought he was. And so, as a result, I became seriously disillusioned. Everyone around me at church seemed to hold these values that I no longer saw as values. They weren't really values in the grand scheme of things. And I also felt as if everyone was staring at me, as everyone is now. And I felt like when I went to church that everyone could tell I was doubting and that I really wasn't a Christian anymore. And I actually, for a short period of time during my deconstruction here, I just kept flip-flopping back between Christianity and this scary thing, atheism. And I didn't want to call myself an atheist. I actually called myself agnostic for a long time because that was like a really easy way to just say, oh, I'm on the fence. But I really never said that out loud at church. I just kept saying, yeah, I'm a Christian, haha. But inside, I was nervous and I was scared that others wouldn't see me as moral anymore. I still had this part of me that sought their approval, but I knew rationally that just because I get approval from people doesn't mean that, what I am thinking is true. There's all sorts of things that you can believe are true and tell others are true, and they agree with you, but that doesn't mean it is. And so I want to summarize all of these points I've been making for all of you. So embracing religion led to a variety of things with these new ideas in my mind and really trying to look at it as clearly as possible. I realized that it reinforced dishonesty. If you recall that story at the beginning of the talk, I was encouraged by others to basically lie about what I actually saw. I was encouraged to see God in circumstances in which he really wasn't. There's no perceptual evidence of God. Embracing religion also produced a lot of guilt, shame, and fear. I was afraid that if I questioned or brought up to a Sunday school class what I actually thought, then people, wouldn't accept me anymore and they wouldn't like me. And I didn't want that. I liked being a part of the community on some level. There's some fun stuff we did, but it was intermingled with fear, shame, and guilt. And lastly, embracing religion required sacrificing my life for God, my entire life. I knew that if I wanted to be a serious Christian, I actually had to give up my life for God, not do this weird tap dance where I, do something that's actually for me, but then I like reinterpret it into being something that's actually for God. A lot of people do that, but I just think it's hypocritical. Just go all in. But I wanted to be consistent, either consistent or not be in it at all. On the other hand, embracing reason offered many things, many good things. It helped me, discover truth. I could use my mind and look at the facts and see that, when somebody made a claim, something is true if there are facts in support of it. Embracing reason also helped me build my self-esteem because I knew that by trusting my reason, I could actually, act on my judgment and make things happen in the world. For example, I went through Praxis, and by building the skills I needed to get a job at a software company, I, could, get that job at the software company. And then embracing reason also put me in control of my life. When I fully accepted that I am capable of knowing things, I was put firmly back in the driver's seat, and God was put in the trunk. So, with all these two big options on the table, what was I going to choose? After all of this, I was trying to get serious about Christianity, but every idea I came up against, it showed me that Christianity doesn't actually add up. I ultimately chose reason. And I think me choosing reason is nicely symbolized in a drive I made on October 14th, 2023. I was living with my parents at the time in Maryland, and I drove all the way to Texas to visit a friend, but it was actually a long-term stay. And there I drove 1,575 miles over 36 hours over a weekend. Terrible drive, don't do that. And I felt like I was finally freed from religion. I felt like I could actually think for the first time. People weren't staring at me anymore. I wasn't pressured by everyone around me. And for this really symbolized my independence and me fully embracing this beautiful power I had in my head, reason. So let me tell you a bit about what my life was after reason, and I'll go through this pretty quickly because we're running up on time here. One thing that reason helped me do is become more at peace with myself. I felt like I could actually live inside my own head and I wasn't actually in conflict with it. Because, as I mentioned before, sometimes thoughts would come up like, oh, I should be obeying God, but I actually want to do this thing. That was no longer there. I also, by embracing reason, I had a new target in life. I knew that my life is this end I should be aiming at, this thing that I should be making the best it possibly is, because it really is all there is. I'm also part of a new team of people that I love to work with, and they all also embrace reason. And I think we're just doing so much good in the world by spreading ideas that help people live better lives. And these people embody my values, and I love them more deeply than they can probably ever know. I also met many new faces, new friends, new colleagues, and people with interesting ideas and hobbies. People who really expanded my view of the world. I would have never been open to these kinds of people before. I would have judged them immediately as a Christian. I thought I knew the truth, and I had this dogma that stopped me from connecting with such beautiful people. Not anymore. With embracing reason, I was open to alternative perspectives. I also visited many new places. This was another way for me to open my horizons and really hug the world. And so I went to a variety of places here on this map. Some of them might be blobs to you. So um, I think this is Czechia, this is Spain, this is France, and Texas and California, and many other places. I also had new experiences. This is actually a picture of me in a play out in California with Fiddler on the Roof. The play Fiddler on the Roof. And above, I'm a Russian dancer. On the bottom, I'm a bottle dancer. Ironically, this is actually a somewhat religious play. But the reason I put myself in this play is because, A, it's kind of fun to dance. And two, I didn't want to be afraid of religion anymore. I felt almost that I had put my tail behind my legs and drove away from my church. So I decided to reinsert myself into another somewhat religious community so that I could show them that I'm okay telling them that I'm an atheist and that I'm not ashamed by that. It's something that I thought deeply about and chose for myself. And I had a fun time too. So I want to leave you all with this. Embrace reason, be honest, and serve yourself. Embracing reason is probably the most important because this is what allows you to figure out these other two. And so, with all that said, thank you all so much for listening to my talk. I suppose we have some time for Q&A. We have about 10 minutes, I think. Okay.
Great talk, Maddox. That was just beautifully done, I gotta tell you. Much better than I anticipated. A good talk from you. That was superb.
Thank you.
So I have a question about your friends from your religious upbringing and experience. Are you in touch with any of them, and have you had any conversations with them about your thinking and reasoning about this stuff?
Great question. Yeah, I'm definitely still in touch with a few of them, but I think our relationships have become a little bit more strained because of what I believe. And when I go out to visit them, sometimes I visit Maryland to visit my family, and I'll, get back in contact with my friends and just tell them what I'm up to. And, they know about my beliefs, but most of our relationship is somewhat like Carrie Ann talked about in her talk. There's different levels of friends, and I think it's more of a um, that friendship in which it's an activity friendship, like, we like to play board games, for example. So, it's more of that level, and in retrospect, this is something else I wanna write about, how a lot of my relationships in church were somewhat superficial because we all operated by faith, and what we thought we were believing were actually technically different things, because if faith is this means of knowledge, which it actually isn't, then what somebody else thinks of God, how somebody else thinks of God might actually differ from what somebody else thinks is God. So there actually, although there seems to be a similarity, there really isn't because you're not actually looking at the same thing.
Yeah. Cool. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the talk. It was amazing. And I wanted to ask you briefly, could you tell us a little bit about how much time and how much effort it went into preparing to speak? Because I understand this is your first public talk.
Yeah, this is my first time.
Yeah. So tell us a little bit about how to become such an amazing speaker.
I appreciate that you think I'm amazing. Um, so what I did is, I mean, the OSI team can attest to this. I wrote a 12-page outline, which really isn't an outline. An outline's supposed to be short for when you're talking. So from that, I boiled it down into a few main points that I wanted to hit, mainly stories, because I think stories are a little bit easier to tell because they're more vivid in your mind and people can relate to them. But besides that, I basically just practiced it over and over again. Leading up to this conference, every day I had a task on my calendar that said practice the talk. And that's what I did. I practiced the talk, and I did it about 30 times before coming here, and I slowly, like, whittled away at it because there were some parts that didn't work, and I recorded myself too while doing this, and then I also this is really important that helped me out, is I fed it in the ChatGPT, my transcripts that I created using a recording software, plugged it in there, and then asked it for feedback, and that was tremendously helpful because that it can go through so much more information for you, and it was a lot quicker. So that's my advice.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Thank you for your talk and thank you for your tips. Yeah, it was really good listening to you. I've also been reading some of your articles on OSI website. It was pretty cool. I consider myself an atheist. I grew up like my house is attached to a Hindu temple, and for me, my route to atheism was pretty simple. Like the loud noise from the temple always annoyed me. um, that's why I was like, if religion is too loud, I can't deal with it. That's why I become an atheist in some sense. Um, but my question to you is whenever people come out of their religion, they tend to be scared to speak about other religions. Like for example, ex-Muslims. We have a lot of ex-Muslims in my part of India. Those people don't speak about other religions. They don't critique other religions. And obviously you were sharing your personal journey, but then you never mentioned any other religion in your talk. Like, was it was it intentional? Do you consider mentioning other religions? I mean, haven't you like I think you have explored other religions. I've seen you speaking about other religions in some other different places, but like was it intentional not to speak about other religions at this talk?
Yeah, I hit on it very minorly in that part about the Muslim lady, and I knocked on her door,
Yeah.
but I think the major reason is because this is basically just my story, but I think all of the primary principles here that I was talking about also apply to all other religions, or not even just religions, but any faith-based way of thinking, any dogmatic way of thinking. And I think that's like especially important because a lot of people go rah rah go against like all religions, but it's not just religions, it's any dogma. And I'm 100% any dogma. So, and then also the reason why I didn't include it is because it's my story, but I also do want to write about other religions. I'm also just not as well versed in other religions. I grew up Christian and I was somewhat insulated from those other things. And America is a very Christian nation, so I'm just really not familiar. So that's part of the reason I don't speak in it. I try my best not to write or talk about things I have no idea what they are.
Yeah. Good. Thank you, and keep going.
Hi, Maddox. I'm very glad to see you on the stage. That was superb. My question is, after you rejected God, did you feel some kind of a void inside yourself because of the emotional ties that people have with God? Like you always feel that you are not alone. There is always someone supporting you. After you rejected God, did you feel some fear and void inside that now you are alone, you are in a complete control of your life?
Great question. I think there were several times in which I avoided it, and I think the primary reason is because I was conditioned to not reject God and just accept him. But I think that there's one this is something I hadn't included in the talk because it's way too long to explain and it's kind of difficult. I'm still wrapping my head around it. But there was a period in California when I was in that play actually, Fiddler on the Roof. I There was a 2-week period in which I was supremely depressed, like so much so that I thought nothing matters and everything's like anything I looked at, I just thought, well, that's gonna die one day, so it doesn't matter. That kind of way of thinking. It was bizarre. It seemed to come out of nowhere. But from some reflection, I think where it did come from is because I actually was like catching up to the fact that after rejecting God, like over here in the timeline, I was catching up to the fact that I hadn't realized that God was my coping mechanism for death. And so I had to like recreate a coping mechanism in a sense. But now my coping mechanism is, oh, you're gonna die, and that's how it is. You just accept it. Um, but really good question. I'll have to write more on that because I think that's something I do want to dig into more. And yeah, you're bringing to mind a lot of ideas. But yeah, thank you for so much for asking that question.
Thank you for that. Hi. I I relate a lot to what you said because I also grew up Catholic and I always questioned my faith because I didn't want to accept just blind faith just because. However, I don't necessarily agree that faith conflicts with reason. So I wanted to ask if you have read philosophers like St. Augustine or St. Thomas Aquinas who approach faith through a more logical path, and if you have, what do you think about them?
I'm familiar that they have dealt with these things, but I really don't know the details of how they, go about reconciling the two. But it's definitely something I want to explore more on my blog and possibly write about. And yeah, for me, I'm not sure I can answer the question.
So I would recommend that you read them because I was in that exact same position. I thought I was agnostic for a long time. And then I talked to a lot of people, a lot of priests, and I wasn't satisfied with the answers they gave me because they weren't really logical until I read them. So, just something for you to consider maybe. And I would love to read you if you ever wrote something about it.
Yeah, definitely will. I actually have Confessions on my bookshelf, and it's been staring at me, and I'll definitely get around to reading that at some point. So thank you.
Thank you. I loved your talk because it spoke to me about what I went through as well.
Thank you. It's the goal. Thank you.
That was fast. Thank you very much for your talk. I have a question based on an experience I made just a couple of months ago. I was doing my research with the Tibetan government in exile, and while I'm an atheist myself, had a very, a pretty unique kind of approach to religion, and saying, I just don't really care about it. I did see a lot of good things happening, especially in this Buddhist context with the Dalai Lama. I got to meet him, and it kind of made me reevaluate my own faith. Would you say, with all the obviously bad experiences you made and all the interesting things that you have mentioned, is there kind of a silver lining in there? Would you say that there are some things in societies that religion does play a very important role in, and that it can't really be replaced by anything else?
That's a good question. I've thought about it very briefly, but I'm no historian, so I really don't have a clue exactly how religion has, done a good thing. I mean, in a sense, like, it's obviously done something. Like, it definitely organizes people's actions together. However, um, I don't think I've done a proper assessment to determine whether or not it's done net good or anything like that. And my current assessment is net bad, at least in my own experience. I'm not really I'm more of like an introspective individualist thinker, and I'm eventually getting more to like the macro side of things, but I think I can only start here with my own experiences first because that's the only thing I really have directly. Um, but definitely a great question. I definitely want to explore stuff like that more.
Thanks.
So, in response to the answer you gave to Daria's question, where you talked about your sort of the feelings of nihilism in effect when you had that brief spell around the Fiddler on the Roof group, um, I wanted to get your thoughts on what you think about this comparison. It's a nice, I think, economic to morality or economic to metaphysics comparison. So you know that if you inflate money, if the government just keeps printing money, what happens to the value of money?
It goes down.
It goes down. And if money was as accessible as air, what would be the value of money?
Not very much at
Would
all.
be zero, right? If money was just free, then it wouldn't have any value at all. If you think about life, if life is limited, that's what gives it value. The very fact that we're going to die is what makes this time so precious, right? And if life was unlimited, if literally there was no end to life, then it's kind of hard to even think in this way. But I think the analogy actually holds. What reason would you have to get up and do anything? Because there's no rush on anything. It's like, well, I don't really feel like getting up, and I don't have to because there's nothing that I can't do later. Later is forever. So it's an analogy that I think can be very helpful to people who who have this idea that, oh, the fact that we're going to die means that nothing matters. Seems to me the fact that we're going to die is what makes anything matter.
Yeah, I think that is a similar conclusion that I reached through that period when I was thinking about it. I think that this reminds me of this TV show called The Good Place. And basically this show, it's a comedy, so it's really funny. So I highly recommend it for if you're into comedy. But also it basically talks about how the premise of it is everyone goes to the good place when they die, and it's basically like heaven. And then there's a twist you'll see if you watch the show. But basically, like, the whole pitch of the good place is it's basically heaven, right? So you live forever, you can do whatever you want. But it turns out in the show, everyone slowly realizes, oh wait, I've done everything I could possibly do. There's really no meaning to this at some point.
Yeah.
With no end, it's kind of worthless, right? It's the same thing
Yeah.
as the money thing.
Yeah, good. Thanks. I just wanted to get your thoughts on that because I think it's really helpful to realize that. I think it's true. It's hard to necessarily get your head around why nothing would matter if you had infinite time. But I think if you really can conceptualize that correctly, you'll see, oh yeah, that would actually be the case.
Yeah.
So, anyway, thanks.
All right. Thank you, everybody.